Well, hello everyone. I'm just delighted to be here today with Stephanie Lamb, artist, businesswoman, married wife, and expectant mother. And for those of you, many of you might remember Stephanie's previous times on this channel where we've talked about art. But today we're going to talk about what does it mean to become a wife? What does it mean to become a mother? What does it mean to become a person, sort of? and and for any young men who are watching, you might want to think about this, because we're also going to talk about what kind of a man does it take to find a woman who is like Stephanie.
Oh my.
Well, okay, maybe that's putting too much pressure on you, but I mean, to find a woman who honors the role of wife and mother. Let's put it that way.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll do. Can I do a bump update? Can I show everyone my enormous tummy? Since I feel like people don't see pregnant women anymore. So I got
Oh wow, you got a bump.
so in case there was any doubt that I am pregnant, I am 9.5 months pregnant, which
Oh wait, eight and a half.
no, pregnancy math. So I know you have a lot of very scientific, technically minded folks that watch your channel.
Uh,
Pregnancy math will drive you bananas when you go down that road because technically it's 10 months, but the first 3 weeks you're actually not pregnant. It's yeah, the timelines of the way they do things and divide the trimesters. I'm like, that doesn't add up, but that's how they do it. So FYI.
Okay,
So
so
yes,
that
I'm
anyway, that means that you're 2 weeks from
2 weeks from my
two
due
weeks
date,
from
whatever that means.
meeting your little girl, and her name is.
Her name is Vesper, Vesper, which means evening prayer.
Mhm.
And I believe it's Latin. And we chose it because my name is Stephanie. My husband's name is Ryan. And given our generations, we went to school with and know probably dozens of people with our names. And so we thought it might be fun to do something where hopefully she's the only kid in school or person her friends know with that name. So that's that story. So yeah.
I did run
So
into a Vesper online who's an artist somewhere, and I can't remember where I ran into her, but so it's not entirely unheard of, but it is
okay.
a beautiful thought. The evening prayer is such a beautiful thought.
Thank you. So where would you like to start?
Um, well, so maybe good to give a little bit of background. I know you've told your story before, but could you just kind of recap um, in just a few minutes what kind of brought you to, well, first of all, why are you the kind of person that would name your daughter evening prayer?
Yeah, so I would say the vocabulary around this in the United States changes, whether it's Jesus follower, born again Christian, but I love Jesus and I consider myself a Christian. And so yeah, that for me, prayer has been the I think most interesting and fun part about having a relationship with God. I've always been kind of fascinated by this idea that we can communicate with something greater than us. And like a lot of folks that are into pop culture, I enjoy the Marvel movies. I like, even before Marvel was a thing, there's some very nerdy shows like Firefly, um, sci-fi stuff that I just really loved, and a lot of it had to do with having, superpowers or a connection to something more spiritual and bigger than yourself. And so to me, prayer is the real life version of that, of being able to have that connection and have that superpower, I guess, if you will. And so yeah, so that's kind of also been maybe the biggest um, challenge in a walk with God, and having in a relationship with God is uh, we don't I don't think we get taught about prayer very well in church. Hearing God's voice, it's a huge frustration for me. And it's something that I struggled with for a long time. I would say, even though I was brought up in a family who believed in Christ and believed in God and went to church, my grandmother was an evangelist. Um, but my family, uh, for lack of a better words, wasn't maybe demonstrating the love of Christ in a lot of ways. Like I know a lot of families and people who have church backgrounds, struggle with that dichotomy. And so yeah, I really just felt like I didn't hear from God a lot and really wanted to. And so for me, prayer has been a journey of figuring out what that looks like for me personally, how I hear God's voice, and what it means to have a relationship with God. Because if, I think one of the things that really annoys me when you get into a lot of the talk about, well, what Christianity is this idea that um, it's a moral code, it's a better way to live, it's a behavior modification program. If you go, depending on what church you go to, and completely misses this idea of it being a love affair, of it being a relationship, of it being a connection. And there's actually a gentleman that I'll recommend that I've been really enjoying his books, called Brennan Manning, Brennan Manning. He's since passed away. His entire ministry, and he will say this, is about reconciling people's relationships to themselves and to God. And his big thing is about, is your relationship to God a love affair, or is it just about um, an authoritarian sort of hierarchy, moral code kind of thing? And I think maybe a lot of us start off that way because we're, especially in this culture, very primed to be like, how can I live my best life? And so people channel that into maybe a more moral, religious version. But ultimately, the transformative part, I think, really happens when we feel loved and accepted by God. And I'm not saying I have that all figured out, but that is something that I keep coming back to and keep trying to keep alive in my own spirit. And prayer is a absolutely essential part of that. And it was a long time before I even realized that I could bring to God all of my feelings and frustrations and be very honest. Like, this sucks. I don't know where the heck you are. I don't know what's going on with my life. And just be very real and raw and not have formality around talking to God. So,
Well, so was there a time between the growing up in the slightly dysfunctional family, which I think we've all grown up in
we've all
slightly
been there,
dysfunctional
right?
families, right? Between that and the time that you discovered this truth about the nature of God's love for us and
Yeah, that's a great
desire for a
question.
relationship.
Yeah, it's been a long journey. Like, another thing that really bothers me about the American church, if you will, evangelical church, whatever you want to call it, is there's a lot of emphasis on this 180 conversion experience, where you were lost and now you're found, you hit rock bottom, and then you completely turn around and have this transformative, my life is not the same, people don't recognize me anymore, all I do is talk about Jesus. And I'm not trying to take that away from anyone. I believe that happens for people, and I think those are fun stories to listen to. It's just not my story. I feel like my story was a lot of times feeling like God wasn't there for me in some of the darkest times of my life, even though He was. It just didn't feel that way. And most of those were my teen years. I went through a lot of pretty severe trauma, sexual trauma, a lot of psychological stuff. My parents, took me to some of the best psychologists in the world, and were like, we don't know what to do with her. And the answer, of course, in our day and age was pharmaceuticals and various treatments. And I always deep down just kind of felt like I needed to be loved and heard. And I feel like my parents were doing the best that they could with the tools that they had. So I'm not trying to throw shade, if you will, on my family. It's just that's where they were at. And they were overwhelmed too with some of the things that had happened to me, trying to figure out how to heal. So um so I actually, was under the care of doctors and things for most of my teen years, and in therapy and trying to process stuff and cope, and dealing with a tremendous amount of PTSD and depression and anxiety, which depression and anxiety run in my family anyway. Um, and it wasn't until um, I was 18, I think, yeah, that I found the therapist that I'm with now, that I've been with for 20 years, which is pretty unusual, and decided to walk away from that part of my treatment and really focus on what I felt like I needed, which was um, not medication. It was um, life change for myself. And again, not trying to say that medication's bad or people shouldn't be on it or anything like that. I just felt like in my spirit, deep down, it was never what I really needed. It was just what the people around me knew how to do to try and help me. And with the work that I've done with my therapist and a lot of just disciplined choices over the years to work on my mental health, I spent most of my 20s just trying to build that. And I will say it is a lot of work. Working on taking care of yourself, I think, is one of the hardest things that we can do, because I remember being very resentful that other people my age in their 20s could go out and party and drink and stay up all night. And I tried those things, and I found that I was so depressed for like the next 3 days that it ended up not being worth it. So I kind of was like, this sucks, for me to be a healthy person, I've got to do this and got to do that. Um and even now I realize, I think when you get older, there's more talk about that. People frame it in the way of, oh, I can't do the things that I used to do. But I think in reality, those things probably were never good for us to begin with. Um, you have different priorities as you get older, and you realize the trade-offs aren't worth it. So yeah, the binge drinking, excuse me, sorry, pregnancy has like acid reflux things that, anyway. Um, there's a lot of choices that I made in my 20s that I felt very alone and isolated. I guess is my point. So if there's anybody out there that feels like they're taking care of their mental health is a lot of work, and they're frustrated and they're feeling lonely and they're feeling like this isn't fair because other people in their 20s are having so much more fun while you're over here trying to just keep your stuff together, I get it. And I would say you're you're totally not alone. And for me, that was the path that I had to take, and it was worth it. But it is tough to feel like you are choosing a road less traveled when you already feel, alone for various reasons. Like, I think most of my 20s, because of the background that I had, I ended up actually dropping out of high school because of all the emotional struggles that I was dealing with, and taking my proficiency exam. My parents were worried I was never going to go to college, but I ended up doing the junior college route and then transferring to university and getting an MBA. So I ended up having all of the things that they were worried I wasn't going to have. But I had to do it in a different way, and it was um, it was challenging, but it was definitely worth it. And it's everything from prioritizing exercise and diet to keeping my therapy appointments and making the financial sacrifice to go to therapy, joining support groups, getting outside, um, and also just really suffering through a lot of bad social experiences just to try and connect with other people my age. I did get involved in different churches, and went to Bible studies and young professional groups, and a lot of times just felt very disenchanted and disappointed with the social interactions that I was having. And I know I've talked to a lot of younger people that, and by younger I mean I'm 38, so people that are in their 20s that are like, yeah, I feel the same way. I can't find someone to have a decent conversation with. And
Well, could you say more about what it was that you were looking for in those relationships that you weren't finding?
Yeah, it's so I think there was a combination of things that was happening for me. I think one was my my expectations maybe weren't in the best place, in the sense that I was wanting too much out of too few people. And I think as I've gotten older, I realize a lot of life is about grieving. It's about grieving what you wish was the case and then what is the case. And that sounds, unfortunately, maybe more negative than the reality ends up feeling when you're walking through it. Because I think there's great power in realizing when you start realizing, oh, this happens, uh, that I just need to grieve this part. I need to grieve this disappointment. But look, there's all these other options and potential gifts over here. And suddenly your focus just shifts and you're not really so much focused on the loss, at least for me. Over time, that's happened. Um,
Well, I don't want you to lose your thread, but just FYI, that's going to happen a lot as a mom
okay.
because because you have this lovely little bundle of joy that's like 6 months old and all cuddly and warm and soft, and they'll sleep against your chest. And then all of a sudden, that little bundle is gone. And then there's a 1 year old that has demands on you that's a completely different person. And where did that little 6 month old go? And you have to grieve the loss of that one in order to enjoy this one, right?
Right.
And then
I
pretty
could
soon
totally
this
see
one is
that.
2 years old, and and they have more personal will and everything involved. And so you're all every stage you're going to grieve the one that you lost and turn to the one that you have. And it
Yes.
motherhood is just like that all the way up.
Okay. Thank you for that heads up. Yeah. We don't talk about this enough as a society. Like, there's so much grieving that happens it can happen on a daily basis. But when you recognize it as such, I think it doesn't have to feel like you're walking through life crying and Eeyore-ish.
Well,
It just
you have an MBA. This maybe sounds a little mechanical, but would you put it in the same category as opportunity cost?
um it's a little bit different, I guess, in the sense that it's opportunity cost is like what you give up, right? And I guess at some point, I get the connection that you're trying to make is that like you're trading one thing for another. But I guess maybe more I'm referring to this idea that psychologically you can move through that space in a I hesitate to say faster, but I think what I'm trying to touch on is when you hear other people talk about experiences, the English language can be so limiting. And I feel like the word grief triggers a lot of things for people. And it sounds very big and unmanageable and heavy. And same with the word mourn, it's just like, oh. And so, but I don't have a better word for it. And adjusting expectations doesn't touch on the emotional component of the sadness that you feel. So, and maybe I just am sort of a melancholy soul. My husband and I were
Well,
coming up with,
maybe it's this idea of accepting suffering as being a reality in life, but that there can be purpose in the suffering if you face it voluntarily, and you can move through that and then get to the other thing that's waiting for you. Is that
definitely. Oh, that's definitely true. And maybe it's just my own projection of when I was when I was 20, I didn't want to hear about suffering and grief. I'm like, I got my whole life ahead of me and things are going to go up and to the left, so please don't use those words. My therapist reminded me, she's like, yeah, when I was talking to you about marriage back before you were married, you didn't want to hear any of this stuff. And I'm all, yeah, that's true. I didn't. I didn't want to hear that, like, this reality stuff bites. And maybe too, that was because I was just in a place of so much struggle that I wanted some hope. I wanted to hear people ahead of me talk in a positive, affirming way. And this is one thing I will say about motherhood that really ticks me off so much is that we don't hear parents talk enough about what a joy it is to have children. We hear a lot of complaining. And I've had conversations with my husband about this because I'm like, this was a real detractor for me before I decided to sign up for this gig. And he's like, yeah, but you know what? People will complain about anything. And so, he's a personal trainer. So he hears people complain all day long. He's like, people always find something to complain about. And I'm like, that's true. Um, but I don't think parents realize the damage that they do to those of us who are considering children or who don't have children when they spend a lot of time talking about how they used to be able to go out and have a night to themselves or they used to be able to take a bubble bath and then they had children. Like, oh, please. I mean, I'm not saying that things don't change when you have kids, but it's also kind of sad, I think, for our society that happens so much.
Well,
So
I
anyway,
think I think a lot of it is what the media has done, though, because I mean, I have two daughters and they're widely apart in age. So I've kind of went through a generation of what's going on out there in the world between these two daughters. So I've watched things change in the media over time. And I've always, in talking to anybody that I meet, tried to talk about what a joy and a privilege it is to be a mother, and that childbirth has its challenges, yes, but what you get afterwards, all the memory of those challenges just goes away because the joy is so great afterward, So
well,
but I just say that, and then there's some TV show which focuses on the birth. And of course, they always have this woman screaming and yelling and
you did
suffering, and
this
they're
to
trying to hold
me.
her down, and she's screaming at her husband. And, you know,
Yeah.
it's represented so graphically in every comedy and every drama that you see. And
Yes.
then whenever they have a historical drama, she always dies after childbirth. And, I mean,
She
they just
bleeds
do
to death.
everything they can to make childbirth look like this monstrous thing.
Yeah. Yeah. There's actually a term for fear of childbirth. I can't remember what it is. Before we do the childbirth conversation, though, I do want to go back because
I
you'd
don't want
asked.
to do the childbirth conversation. I want to
Well,
get back to the main
I
line.
just I have something that I wanted to say about that. But before I do, I wanted to mention as far as the friendships thing in the 20s, in my 20s, some of it was expectation. So I was trying to get too much too soon out of connections with people my age, for one, over too small of a group of people. And what I have since learned because I would say now, I feel very blessed to have a wonderful handful of relationships with women of various ages, but also women of my age. And um, and I think I've just realized that I have friends that are good for one thing and friends that are good for another thing and friends that are good for this and friends that I can do this with. And it's amazing like to be able to do that because as much as I think TV shows and movies probably shaped a lot of this, the idea of the girlfriends that you've got a cluster of two or three or four women that are just all besties and they all do these wonderful girls nights together and everyone's on the same page. And I think if you end up finding that, props to you. I've never had that, and I don't feel like I'm at a loss for rich friendships. I'm much more a one-on-one person anyway. Not to say that I couldn't get a handful of my closest friends together and we couldn't have a great time. We could, but our lives just don't fit together that way. And I tend to be a person with a lot of different interests. So, for example, I've got a girlfriend that I go horseback riding with on a regular basis, and she and I have a very different dynamic. We go horse camping, we go horseback riding, we talk about different things. I have a girlfriend who I don't know if she's ever even been on a horse. Um, and we do other things together. I have a girlfriend who is a doctor that lives down in LA that I only see maybe once or twice a year. But when I do see her, we kind of just manage to pick up right back where we left off. She's Chinese, I'm half Chinese. And so a lot of our connection is over that sort of shared cultural experience, being Asian professional women. So, like I feel like God brings different people for different reasons into your life. Like our relationship, we can talk about, we can go deep like that. We sit down and have lunch and then all of a sudden we're like into some really deep stuff. And I have a lot of girlfriends that I could never do that with. So, it's, I think being open and flexible when you're trying to make friends with people, about getting to know who they are and letting it take time. I think that was the other thing that was hard for me, is I was so desperate to make connections with people and to feel seen, that I wanted that to happen quickly. And it's not a microwave process, it's a slow cooker process. And unfortunately, I don't know any way around that other than to just be patient and consistent. And sometimes that means having coffee with people that you're kind of like not that excited about at first for a while, but you kind of just keep having coffee and showing up and finding things to connect about. And then, you know, years later, you're like, hey, we're actually pretty close and we've shared a lot of life together. And maybe the initial judgments that I have about you ended up being my own projections or my own judgments and not really who you were. Now, that's not to say you waste time on relationships that just aren't going anywhere, but I would say I was more on the other end of it, where I was maybe prejudging and having too many high expectations early on. So I think that was a big thing for making friends in my 20s, is just not being aware of how much time it took, and how patient I needed to be with the process, and flexible, um, and uh, and recognizing too it's harder when you aren't in school anymore, because proximity is such a powerful component of your social relationships, whether it's your workplace or your school usually. And so you've got to make more of an effort, I think, when you move on to, jobs and work life. And if you don't want to make friends with the people that you work with, then you have to take time every week to set up coffees and show up even if you don't feel like it, and being consistent, and don't be the person that flakes, and you know work like anything else. So yeah.
But I think so the challenge must have been magnified if you were already dealing with depression and loneliness, and then having all these disappointments in friendship. And so what was the thing that kept you going through that? I mean, some people faced with that challenge time after time would give up and just crawl into bed and stay there for 2 or 3 years. So.
Sure. Yeah, no, I totally get it. And yeah, it was very discouraging. And sometimes having a not great coffee with someone felt like a huge blow. Um, and so I would say a couple of things. One is, again, the non sexy answer, which is, well, the better option is what? To crawl into bed? It's like I kind of felt like I didn't have a better choice, which is unfortunately, I mean, I'm just being honest here. I feel like sometimes that's how faith feels. It's not that you love Jesus all that much, it's just you realize you don't have a better choice. And then maybe you have days where you really just love Jesus and you feel like God loves me. And like, you know, first I'm pregnant, so I cry about everything. But like the reality that people don't talk about is like, sometimes you're like, well, what's the other option? To not keep going? To do something that I know is probably going to make my brain worse, my body worse, and then I got to crawl out of that hole? Like, that sounds pretty crappy too. Um so then in the short term, I have found a lot of solace in having different interests, so that when the social component of my life was not going so well, or as well as I hoped, I still had something that I could do to distract myself. I think we maybe underestimate the power of distraction for good. Not to say that we repress our feelings and all the stuff, but sometimes having something to go do immediately after that disappointing coffee, or maybe it ends up not being a disappointing coffee.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, those things have been my art. I've always found that to be enjoyable and simultaneously painful for various reasons, which is a completely different conversation. If you're a creative type, you already understand that struggle. Animals for me have been huge. I was very big into dog rescue, dog training, and horses, I think now at this point in my life, have been incredibly powerful. There is something about having an activity that helps you feel powerful, in whatever that looks like for you. I mean, it could be cooking, it could be hiking. For me, it's horses. Like, they're these gorgeous, enormous animals that we have the privilege of interacting with and having a relationship with and figuring out how to, I'll say, control, for lack of a better word, because they still have their own mind. So you really don't ever fully control them, but you get to ride on their back and have them do things that you ask. And to me, that's just this phenomenal privilege. And it also opened up an opportunity to be outside, to slow down, to get away from a screen, which we're all learning is so important. So having, start building those things for yourself, I would say, if you don't have them, because that was a huge saving grace for me, is I was never at a loss for activities that I could get interested in. And I think when the emotional social side of my life wasn't going so well, it gave me something else to do. And it also had the added benefit too of, even when the emotional social side of my life isn't going well now, where I feel like I have deeper relationships, I have a husband, right? So you could argue, oh, but the companionship factor is always there because you're married, right? It's like, no, you can feel even more devastatingly lonely in a marriage sometimes
Yeah.
than you can feel.
We always say the you can have, now how does that go? The worst day of your single life can't possibly be matched by the worst day of your married life.
Oh gosh. Yeah, when I think about the comparisons actually in terms of loneliness between the two, I would definitely say I was more chronically lonely in my 20s, in the sense that I had more days alone where I longed for someone and I longed for companionship, and I was filling my time with my own routines and things. But I think the peaks and valleys, the amplitude of the emotional graph being married is heightened. So, the length of the graph was more severe and consistent, maybe, of loneliness in my 20s, but then when I got married, it was like, yeah, it's a different, and I guess maybe too because it's the expectation and the experience of having felt known. Hopefully when you get married, you've had the experience of that person getting you. And it's just this amazing feeling if someone truly gets me and accepts me and loves me, even in small ways, right? They don't have to necessarily get all of you. And then to feel rejected or betrayed in the moments where you're fighting or you have unresolved conflict that you don't see a way out of can be really quite devastating to experience. So,
Yeah, it's the not seeing your way out of, I think, that makes it so powerfully challenging. Because for whatever reason, you can have, I mean, I can remember lots of fights that we had in our marriage where it just felt like this could never resolve. There's no hope for this. I can't see any way out. But what I was really seeing was inside my own worldview, given where I'm at right now, if I'm unwilling to move or open my mind or let Jesus change something in me, yes, there's nothing that can be done about this. It's over.
right.
So we might as well. But we had determined early on in our marriage that we would not ever use the D word, even in an argument.
Okay.
That was not ever an option. And it happened to come out, I think we got married right after, or some maybe contemporaneous with the Apollo 13 movie, where Ed Harris says failure is not an option.
I remember that.
Yeah, failure is not an option. So you got to find something else. You got to find another way through, Maybe you grieve some lost expectation at that moment, right? Or maybe you grieve whatever fantasy world you were living in. You thought this other person was this certain person that you thought they were, and maybe they're not that person, but they are a person.
Mm-hmm.
And you can learn to love this person that you've got.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I pinned a lot of hopes on my marriage and my future husband, and a lot of fantasy. And I think some of that's normal. I think some of that is shaped by how our culture views marriage, and I think that's part of human nature too. So it's an interesting process, and like you said, going back to the grieving thing, it's a lifelong process of taking the fantasies that we create, the the icons, the pillars, whatever, and then having reality deconstruct them and reshape them to look maybe more like um, Picasso in his not the blue period. What is it? When he Georges Braque and the whole yeah,
Yeah.
and still
Well, so
beautiful.
so here you are, you're in your 20s,
Mm-hmm.
maybe the late 20s. You've got dogs, you've got a horse, you've got a thriving career. You're an artist, you're winning awards, you have your solo show at the museum. Um, why even think about marriage? You've already got a full life. What can a man add to that?
Um, I always wanted to be married. I always, speaking of fantasy, I always liked the idea of having someone special in my life that was um an intellectual equal, someone I could have really hot sex with, like just all the things, right? And so again, the alternative to being married would be to have a string of relationships that were um I don't know, like don't stay the night. Um which, having been someone who has survived sexual trauma, I have no illusions about the impact sex has on a relationship and on a person. I think it's incredibly profound. Speaking of like the whole superpower thing that I love the idea of us all having superpowers. Um, Sex is its own superpower, and it's really unfortunate how much our society has downgraded that and doesn't talk about it. Um, so yeah, for me, the idea of having sex with someone that I wasn't in a committed relationship with, just I knew that that was just asking for a lot of problems for me personally. Um, and I feel things very deeply, and I get connected and attached to things very deeply. So that was one practical aspect of it. Not to mention, there's all the diseases and things that we have to worry about these days if you're bouncing around. Um, and um, I mean, I don't like to. I don't talk about myself as someone that likes challenges, but when I look back on my life, I realize I pick hard things.
Yes, you do. I was about to bring up how you met your husband,
Yeah, like I
which
mean,
was, I mean, all of a sudden you decided just out of the blue with everything else going on in your life, you didn't have enough to do. So you decided to become a bodybuilder and enter a competition.
I did. Yeah, I did one of those bikini competitions,
Yes.
folks. So if you Google what is it, the NFC? No, what is it? Yeah. Anyway, you wear basically nothing and you get a spray tan like an Oompa Loompa and you train your butt off for months. And it was a good experience. I learned a lot about myself, portion control being one of them. But also too that like your relationship to food, you have to be very careful about how you treat that because I had to do some repair after that. Um, yeah, I do pick hard things. And I guess I don't know, marriage seems like a I'm also kind of maybe a rebel too. Like one of the things that drives me bananas is there's so much out there in the world about one thing or another and then you get into doing it and you realize, "Oh, it doesn't have to be that way. Why doesn't anyone talk about this?" And to use some concrete examples, um, I've been very involved with pit bulls, the dogs, for many years. And if you go back to the 90s and 2000s, and even today, I think the image has changed a lot. But, they are dangerous dogs that cannot be trusted, that will turn on you no matter what. And that is pretty much what the internet says and what most general wisdom public agreement is. And then I got into doing it and it was like, oh, this is pretty much a lie. um, and I'm like, what else is a lie? Um, and so that's just one very small example. I can give you, we can talk about the media. Um, Again, back to the pit bull thing, we got, if you guys remember Michael Vick, who was a football player who did horrendous things to these dogs. And it was the first time that people even considered, well, maybe we don't kill them all. Maybe we evaluate them and see if they can be saved. Fight bus dogs, that is, the dogs that were confiscated from his property. And I worked with some of those dogs. One of them was a therapy dog before he died. It's like, oh, that was a lie. And in the process of that, got to interact with the media. And we had reporters constantly calling us, wanting interviews about these sensational dogs that had done a 180 and how we had rehabilitated them. And it was like, well, they came to us with agendas already. They already had blanks they just needed to fill. It really soured my view of the media. And this was back in 2006. So I hardly watch the news anymore after that experience, not to mention everything that's happening now, because I'm very aware of just how biased it is and
Yeah. Yeah.
how reporters have to operate because of the way the system is and how some of them choose to operate. So there's just like a lot of things in life, I feel like, that we are fed that this is how it is. And we even get that reinforced from people around us who really don't know. Um, and motherhood's another, I think, great one of those things. And so I've always just kind of been like, yeah, whoever they is, they lied about that. What else did I lie about? So I think marriage maybe is one of those things too, where I'm kind of like, the message you continually hear is that you're going to get divorced. It's going to be miserable. You're going to end up, um, whatever horrible perception you have. And I'm always like, well, does it have to be that way? Could it be some way else? Curiosity maybe, or desire to just flip my middle finger at, uh, I don't know, all the things that have oppressed me as a woman. Let's flip our middle finger at those things. How about instead?
Well, that's a good question. Have you ever felt oppressed as a woman?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, shoot. I was an English major for my undergrad, and I remember taking some like deconstructionist, feminist literary theory classes. I was really angry for a long time. um,
Because they made you think about things you hadn't thought about before, or because they just opened an opportunity for you to talk about things that you had thought about before?
both, both. Yeah. And I think, yeah, and it gave me language to talk about some things that had bothered me. So, and I came to those classes with my own history, right? We all come to that stuff with our own history of experiencing what it is to be a man or a woman, and how our mother or how our father treated us. So I'm not going to pretend that like there weren't some daddy and mommy issues that I was grappling with at the same time, because I spent a lot of my 20s being very angry at my parents and having to work through a lot of my family origin stuff. And it wasn't until my 30s that I really felt like, okay, that was good to do, good to be aware of how dysfunctional and all the stuff I've had to work through as a result of poor choices made by my parents. But then at some point it's like, yeah, but it's my life now. I'm only going to let that hold me back for so long. Um, the anger gets tiresome after a while. Anger is so draining. So, yeah, I don't know, like this is going to sound
I'll just say it.
well, at some point you get tired of being angry and pissed off, right? Or at least I hope we do. I did. Like I got tired of looking at everything as someone treating me badly because I was Asian or female. And like So I'm not gonna lie, there's still things that really tick me off. That I look at and go, yeah, if I was a dude, you wouldn't be doing this to me. For example, one thing that I've had to explain to my husband, he's a big guy, he's a power lifter, he's a personal trainer, so he's very much like a man's man. Like he chops the firewood, he has all the tools. I actually came into our marriage with more tools than him, FYI. But um he does not know what it is like to experience people not moving off the sidewalk for like making space for you on a sidewalk. And that drives me nuts. And I've had this conversation with other girlfriends. It's like when you're a woman and you're walking down the street sometimes, like guys don't move. They expect you to move. And it's a very subtle body language thing. So like there's stuff like that that
Yeah,
sometimes
that's
comes
funny. I
up.
have that experience with women too.
Do
So,
you?
well, and I never noticed it ever. I guess because I had never been in a place with a lot of people, but I never noticed it until I lived in Japan. In Japan,
Hmm.
nobody moves for you.
Interesting.
You got to move. You get out of the way. The crowd's coming your direction. You just got to get out of the way because they're going to plow you over.
Now, do you feel like that was cultural? Like they saw you as being a foreigner and therefore they were like, yeah, she doesn't matter? Or was it
Oh,
more
it
that
never
there was
occurred
more
to
of
me. I
them?
just thought there's so many people here that they don't. Um, I kind of looked at it as every person, in order to survive in a culture like that where there's so many people, you have to own your space.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, right.
Hong Kong's like that
So this
too.
is my space, so you're going to get out of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, not the culture is not rude in any way. So I'm not trying to say it's rudeness. It's just you have to have a certain sense of space there. Otherwise, you're just going to get annihilated.
Yeah.
I mean,
No, it's true.
they jam you into the train, and if you don't own your space where you're at, you're going to get annihilated. So
Yeah. Yeah.
it never occurred to me to think of it as male or female or anything. And I I have heard all the stuff about oppression of women and everything. And maybe it's just old fashioned on my part, but I always think, well, what about the guy who says, why am I the one that has to crawl under the house to get the dead rats out of there? Or, why am I being oppressed by being expected to be the one that climbs up onto the roof and takes care of the bird that got down in the chimney? Or, why am I the one that has to dredge out the dirty toilet? And
Right.
I mean,
No,
so
and
I mean, in a
I
way,
get
men
that.
get oppressed too, but we never think of that as oppression because they want to be heroes. So
Yeah, and I also I feel like that the tricky thing about this conversation now is that, everyone's on such extreme sides. So I still, because of the line of work I do, I'm in fundraising. I look at pictures on a daily basis of women being oppressed in other countries. So I'm very
mhm,
familiar with what's happening in other parts of the world, men and women,
mhm.
with um, how disgustingly cruel and unfair. Uh, and that's not to say that genital mutilation is the only kind of oppression we can talk about because you know sexism in the workplace doesn't count. I it happens here too. So I'm not trying to take that away from anyone's experience. I see it. I agree with it. It drives me nuts too. I'm more, I guess, just speaking from a personal standpoint in terms of uh you know being a feminist or whatever. Again, it's like when people ask me if I'm a feminist, I'm like, well, how are you defining feminism? Because here we go, this is a long conversation.
I
um
know. Is it
because
first
on one
wave,
hand,
second wave, third wave, fourth wave?
yeah, well, and on one hand it's like, get out and vote, ladies. Like, do you know what it took for us to get the vote? Like, and being appreciative of, I'm sure my husband probably thinks or thought I was weird when I was first talking. And I talked to my stepdaughters about this, about like, hey, if we had been born 100 years ago, this is what our lives would have looked like. How blessed are we? This is amazing. Um, I was just like, oh, okay. Uh, but I personally got to a point where I was tired of being angry, and I was tired of looking at everything through a lens of someone is doing me wrong. um I think it's important to put on those glasses, wear them for a while, absolutely, work through the anger, work through the frustration, um the resentment. If you feel called to, get involved on a social or political level, by all means. um but like, I just got exhausted and got to a point where I was like, I just want to be happy. Which is where I was trying to figure out how to say that. It sounds so trite. Like, I just want to be happy. It's a whole nother conversation on what is happiness and versus contentment and blah blah blah. But I hopefully people understand what I'm trying to say. And I felt that constantly viewing how I was experiencing everyday life through that lens was not serving me, I guess is the point. It wasn't helping me build a life that I felt like was, it didn't allow me to have a generous spirit at all.
Mhm.
It put me on the defensive quite a lot, and it wasn't freeing. It felt more like a cage. So, and I felt like I owed it to myself with all the freaking therapy that I've done and all the hard work I've done on my mental health to try and unlock as many cages for myself as I could. And
I
so,
think that's a great picture. It's a great picture
thanks.
because there's so many things that we can do in life that create a cage for ourselves. And it kind of reminds me, people that have listened to this channel before are familiar with John Vervaeke, the psychologist from Ontario, who talks about agape being a kind of reciprocal opening up of your life into generosity and openness and all that. But on the other side, addiction or that kind of thinking, that sort of worldview, that it's a reciprocal narrowing. So pretty soon your focus gets so narrow that there's nothing else in your life that means anything except that anger or that addiction or that thing that you have to have or that next dopamine hit that comes from scrolling the angry stuff online, right?
Right.
And it's this reciprocal narrowing that takes you down into this space that's just like a prison, because then you have nothing. You have no freedom. You have no freedom to think or experience or interact with other people or find joy, or it's just, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it can be quite painful. And yeah, I mean, I remember the day when I realized, oh my gosh, people don't look at me as white, or maybe people don't. Like, I had this Asian epiphany, like I might actually look Asian and people might treat me differently because of that. Um yeah, and it kind of was a weird experience, and then I was like, well, okay, it is what it is. I mean, everyone's got stuff they're having to overcome in the perception of other people's eyes. So um yeah, I got tired of feeling that was holding me back. Now, when it came to actually like dating and finding someone to marry, um yeah, I mean, then it becomes deeper and a whole lot more complex, because I was like, oh, is this going to be a different kind of cage? I think motherhood, in particular, I had a lot of anxiety around that shifted for me. Um because I did have a lot of fears about how unbalanced or unfair, our society is around, you know, the thing I always said is like, well, I have dogs. I can crate my dogs. I can't crate a child and go out and have a good time. And so this idea of feeling burdened and saddled with never getting a break, from a kid, and the vulnerability that created, the dependence it created on a man then, or on someone else. And yeah, that's very scary. And my husband is the kind of guy that, I feel like he's got my back, and he'll say that I've got your back. We're a team. You're not doing this alone. And I've actually gotten to see that in action, because I am a stepmom. I have two teenage stepdaughters, and so I've seen how he is with them. And then, we've been married for almost 4 years now. So he's had a chance to prove it. And that's a big part of why I even was willing to be like, yeah, I think I want to do this. Um, a guy who does get angry about the injustices that women face is warming to my heart. Just like I would hope that a woman who gets angry about the injustices guys face would be warming to his. The fact that we see each other and that we recognize that we each have challenges that we face, discrimination that we face, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to like think back to the place I was at where I was very much like, I'm not going to let a man hold me back.
Well, so when you were at that space, but you still wanted to get married, what kind of, did you have a list of what you were looking for in a man, or,
Well, that's a great
was it
question.
just like, I'll know it when I see it?
I had a spreadsheet. Yeah, I'm one of those. I did eHarmony was the thing to do then. I don't know what it is now. It's like you swipe left and right, apparently. But I did the online dating thing and I did the church dating thing. And yes, I had a list of must-haves and can't stands and would be nices. And the funny thing that happened for me is that I dated those guys to a point. I mean, obviously, like, you make your ideal list and then you realize, like, okay, we'll see. But I dated a couple of guys that were good on paper, really good on paper, and they did not love me. I mean, that's kind of what it came down to. I even was almost engaged to one of them, and yeah, like I feel like my husband would do anything for me, and when it came to the guys I was dating before him, it was um it was a good fit in the eyes of other people. Oh, you both have master's degrees and you both are wanting the same things, and um we both like salsa dancing, and um we've both done some traveling, and so we have the same expanded worldview. And yeah, we like some of the same books, and for the most part we vote the same way. And I will say, Jordan Peterson talks about you want to try and marry someone more similar to you than not. I think there's wisdom in that. I did his personality course, and I'm telling my husband, I'm like, you need to do it, because there's a way you can hook up your accounts and kind of see how compatible you are. And I'm like, oh, this is going to be a hoot, because I am very low in orderliness, and my guarantee you my husband is probably like off the charts in the other direction. Um, so that's actually one of the things that we've had to negotiate quite a bit in our relationship. But yeah, when it came down to it, it was like the whole checklist thing. I think it's a useful exercise, to know yourself, to be able to say, this is where I think I'm at in my life and who I am and what I think I need and what would be good for me. But when it came to actually finding the person, like doing the whole checklist thing made me more focused on, I guess, the checklist than on really paying attention to what he was doing rather than what he was saying. And that's one of the things that I think is amazing about my husband is he does. And I appreciate that so much more as I get older. Is I almost and I get this too from dog training. People would come to us in these classes and they'd be like, well, this is Fluffy. Fluffy has a really hard time with men. And sometimes when we go for walks, he likes to lunge and jump. And we really think it's because he was traumatized as a puppy. And, and then they'll tell you their whole story. I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but it's like, you get this whole earful of like, okay, okay. And then you take the dog and you evaluate and you work with the dog. And, you find, oh, the owner didn't tell you X, Y, or Z, or they're completely just not interpreting the animal's behavior appropriately. And so you almost just kind of like don't listen to anything they say and just look at what the dog does. And that tells you what you need to know right there is that body language and that experience that you get from just having worked with a lot of dogs. And I feel like dating is kind of similar. I've learned so much about marriage and dating from training dogs.
Well, I mean, that whole thing about action, I think that's been one of the great tragedies of my life, is coming face to face with the fact that, and I probably didn't even realize this until I was in my 50s, is that I really wasn't acting out my values. I had certain values that I was judging the world by, but I myself wasn't living by them a lot of the times, because there was some sort of thing inside me that thought, well, I mean, it's subconsciously or unconsciously, yes, but that rule doesn't apply to me. You know?
Right.
If I eat an extra piece of cake, it's not going to make a difference to me,
right.
Right?
Totally.
Yeah. Or, if I let my room get messy, I can appreciate order, but so what if, I let my room get messy? It doesn't apply to me.
Doesn't.
And coming face to face with that was like, oh my gosh.
It's kind of horrifying, right?
Yes. And it was particularly horrifying because my husband is a man of action. He just does. He just gets things done. He has a list every day of what needs to be done, and he's always thinking about what needs to be done, and he just does it.
Right.
And for many years, I resented that about him, because it put such demands on me to judge my own self by my own lack of action.
Oh, yeah.
Instead of learning to appreciate, wow, I could use him as a model.
Sure.
I could learn something from him instead of being irritated with him, So yeah, I think that's such a big one. And that was one of the eye openers, I think, for me in listening to Jordan Peterson, is the way he frames it about action makes it so kind of easy to absorb. It's like, oh yeah, okay. So yes, it is a problem. There's a way to overcome that. You just start acting.
Right.
You just get after it.
Yes. No, like my husband will do, and I'm, if you're into the whole love languages thing, for me it's touch and what is it, the action
Acts of service.
acts of service. Thank you. So my husband has helped me go out and fix my horse trailer, and he'll make time to take me to, go, like I dropped off my truck today to get a cover put on it, and he's gonna pick me up. And I don't know, it's just like I know I can count on him if I need help for something. But I also want to clarify, because I know there's some guys that might go to the other end of the spectrum and say, well, I did everything for this girl and she rejected me. One thing that I think is included in being a man of action is being a man of boundaries. So if you're the type of person that it doesn't mean that girls want a guy that will completely divest themselves of themselves, I guess maybe is what I'm trying to say, because there's a way to go too far with that. Sacrificial is sexy, yes, but so is being like, yeah, I'm not going to do that. Or I don't know, I think there have been times where I realized the issue was that I wanted us to agree because it made me more comfortable for us to be in agreement on something. And my husband looked at me and said, we're just going to have to agree to disagree on this. Like, I have a different view than you. And that's something we've both actually had to work on. But for him to be strong in that and to say, this is who I am, this is what I believe, I hear what you're saying, and he will hear me, which means actually repeating back to me what I said, not just saying I hear you, but saying, okay, so it sounds like you're feeling really hurt and ashamed when this comes up for you, and I can see how that would be painful. Like that's hearing someone. Oh yeah, speaking their feelings back to them, right? But when it came to the actual like issue itself, he's like, I still feel like this is, what I need to do, or the perspective that I have. And then it's just kind of like, oh. And it was just one of those conversations where I realized, yeah, we're separate people, and there's no reason for me to need him to have to agree with me on this. Sometimes it's just uncomfortable to be in a relationship where you have different views about things. And it wasn't something that we needed to come together on. It was, I think, just an ideological thing or something. I can't remember what it was. But so there's times where being a person of action, whether you're a guy or a girl, I think means sticking to what you believe to be true. That doesn't mean you are a jerk or disrespectful,
Mm-hmm.
or that you can't be present for someone, or that you can't hear their feelings or be compassionate or curious, because those are all super important too, especially when you get into these intense conversations. Like, one of the things that's super important to me is like, be curious about my experience. You don't have to agree with me, you don't have to like what comes out of my mouth, but ask questions, try to get inside my head, try to understand what it is to be me, and be compassionate and empathetic. At the end of the day, we may still have to figure out how to negotiate and compromise on the solution to this, but feeling heard is, you're not going to get to a solution without resentment if you don't hear each other, right? So that's something we're always working on. It's very hard.
Well, but I mean, going through that in your marriage, it sounds like it's prepared you well to be that kind of a mom that you'll be able to hopefully.
I hope so. We'll
Yeah.
see. We'll
Well, so
see.
I know we're probably running out of time here. I know you have a busy professional life, so I don't want to take up your whole day, but
Well, I'm on maternity leave now, so
oh,
I'm like, yoo-hoo. Supposed to be. We'll see.
um, in terms of making the decision to have a child, was there a certain sense of sacrifice that you kind of had to go through, that you had to think through, pray through, or anything before you made the decision to get pregnant?
Nope, I'm just knock me up. No, I'm kidding. I'm totally kidding.
And make a great headline for the show.
Feel like
Knock me up, man.
I want to stay at home and bake sourdough and pop out babies. I Yes. So I would say, so there's lots of layers to this. One layer is that I just deeply believed and felt like at this point in my life this was the next step for me. Um and I have since checked in at all the very difficult parts of being pregnant and going, do I regret it? Do I regret it? Like, this is really hard. And I was like, no. So that's been a lovely confirmation. Um And just to be clear, I didn't want kids. I went into our marriage very clear that I wasn't interested in kids. And I was very relieved to marry a guy who already had kids, because I felt like that took the pressure off me. I will say being in a blended family is extremely challenging. Um, so that's another conversation, but that has always been kind of my stance. Is I have never been, I mean, I played with dolls, and I um, did a lot of the girly things as a kid. But as I got into adulthood, I was never the person that imagined myself as a mom, or was like, I want a family someday. I wanted to be married and have someone special, but I never was like, I want the kids. So it came as a real surprise to everyone who knew me when I was like, I'm pregnant. I had a deep sense of knowing like this was the next step for me. Some of that was because um some of the I mean, honestly, I think a big part of it was just God put that there at that time in my heart. um I'm gonna go back to the horse thing, and this is a weird way to explain why I wanted a kid, and when I think about why it is. So I have a YouTube channel where I talk about being an equestrian. It's called Happier on a Horse. And it's a lot of how-to content. It's a lot of this is what I bring horse camping, and I do trail rides and with a GoPro and talk about horse ownership and that kind of stuff. And I spent most of 2020, most of the pandemic, surviving, being out on trail with my horse. I have this beautiful big draft horse that I ride that I've had for years, and I just adore him. And for me, horses are the closest that I feel like I get to God in my daily life. There's just something about that connection that allows me to feel like I am in a transcendent place. God teaches me a lot of lessons about life with my horse. And it's the most, I'll use the word powerful because I think it's the best word I can come up with, a feeling that I get walking around on this planet is when I ride. And so I went through the pandemic trail riding, horse camping, navigating this relationship with this animal that I've actually fallen off of twice. I've gone to the hospital twice falling off of this horse. So I've had some trauma that I've had to work through with this horse. And to be able to work through those experiences and to feel, to see that relationship shift and evolve just did something for me. And, you can chalk it up to all kinds of things too on a neurochemical level, being outdoors and being physical and the relational component and having to figure out how to train and work with an animal. Like there's so many things, right? But ultimately, that's the vehicle that God chose for me. And I got to 2021 and felt like I had climbed this enormous Everest on so many levels. And there's something about feeling that empowered or powerful in some component of your life that is life changing. And I think what it did for me is it gave me the confidence and the curiosity to be interested in something like motherhood. Um, Not to say, like, if you had asked me before if I was afraid of motherhood, I've been like, no, I'm just not really that interested. Like, give me the cost benefit analysis here, and I'll tell you, it doesn't come out so good for the women, right? Like, we end up with our bodies jacked up. We end up attached to this thing that's going to end up like treating us like crap and leaving us. We become dependent and connected to a guy that may or may not leave us, and then we've got to deal with what child support and alimony and divorce and very very like this is a whole lot of risk. And again, I wasn't seeing a lot of the reward because again, I feel like in our culture we don't see a lot of joyful moms or dads, unfortunately. And so I'm like, yeah, I got my dogs and my horses. I am good. So uh yeah, I just kind of felt like motherhood felt like the next frontier sort of for me. And it seemed I was curious about it for the first time in my life. And when I get curious about something, then it's like, oh boy, here we go. um, because there's something there to be discovered. And I have become convinced over the years, like I mentioned earlier in the conversation, that a lot of what I'm told about how things are supposed to be aren't true. And that makes me um, angry. It also makes me feel a little bit sassy. I'm like, oh, really? Let's see. um, and so I thought, oh, maybe I could figure out a way to do motherhood that would actually be cool. And I haven't seen a lot of it. And again, this is going back to that friendship piece with, you kind of have one friend for this and one friend for that. I feel like I've maybe seen little bits of motherhood that I could cobble together. I'd like to be maybe that kind of mom or that kind of mom, or that would be kind of cool. Or like, actually, that's kind of sexy. Like she's like a mom, but then she's also like hot. Like that's an option. I thought that you couldn't be sexy anymore after you became a mom, or desirable, or have men want you. And you don't want to give that up, especially when you're 25. Um, so yeah, so I think it was a lot of those life experiences through my 20s and then that huge year of of feeling super empowered slash powerful and gaining that unique confidence that really just came with whatever God was doing with me with horses, that got me to a point where I was even interested and excited about trying this thing that I think could be really cool, and I'm excited to do it in my way. And that's the thing too, is after being angry with the whole feminist phase, I definitely don't feel so angry anymore. But what has replaced it is that I feel very passionate. I feel very passionate about, like, someone needs to teach a young woman this. Someone needs to convey this perspective. Now, what she does with it is up to her, right? But this needs to be said. This isn't being said enough. And when you have your own children, hopefully, you have the opportunity to pass that along in a way that's um, more more direct or more frequent than someone that you only talk to once in a while. I don't know. We'll see. I hear they don't listen to you either. So maybe I'm deluding myself.
Well, my own personal experience is that you have up until they're about 10. So make good use of that time.
Okay.
You can impart. Don't get to thinking, oh, there'll always be time to talk about that. No, no, there
No.
won't. No, there won't.
Okay. Okay.
There comes a day when they're enough of their own person that they're not going to listen anymore.
Yeah.
But up until they're about 10, they're usually pretty open to learning whatever you want to give them. And many times even they will act like they're not listening. I remember my older daughter, she was on the softball team, and I never felt like she listened to a thing I said. But one day I was behind the bleachers on my way to her game, and I heard her talking to a friend out in front of the bleachers, and she's giving this girl word for word what I had told her. Well, my
Wow.
mom says that we should do it this way, blah, blah, blah. Whoa, I didn't know
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
She had not only heard it, but she had internalized it and thought it was worthwhile, So
Sure.
you
That's
never
awesome.
know, you just keep doing what you believe is the truth and what's right, and keep on
Yeah,
loving them. And
definitely.
yeah.
Well, and I guess my encouragement to other women would be like, I mean, I totally thrive off of seeing role models and examples, and I feel like there's such a lack sometimes of people who are thriving in various capacities. And what I don't want to have happen is I don't want to get to the end of my life and feel like I missed out because I just was missing a few role models. Not to say that that's not a big deal. Having role models is huge, but um, maybe it's us that has to be the ones to go out and try and figure out a different way to do things so that other people can see it doesn't always have to look like what we think it is. And for everyone, that's going to be different, right? Um, and that's what's kind of cool is like you can. It's going to sound so cheesy. You can make your own path. Um, that's not what I'm trying to reduce this to, but I do feel like I have suffered and been pained by, whether it was my own parents or just, desperately needing to see someone else doing it. And hopefully, your audience can relate to, maybe you finally got to see someone who embodied a little sliver of something in a new way that you were like, that. We need more of that. Whoever you are, however you're doing that thing, you suddenly made that look interesting or cool or enticing to me, and it never has before. And I would agree that, when it comes to like motherhood and marriage, maybe part of why I wasn't ever interested in it is because I didn't see enough of those slices. And so, now I'm hoping in a very humble way to try and figure out how I can do that so that at least I can look at it and go, I tried to do something fun and cool with it. And I also believe that it doesn't have to define all of who I am, which is another thing I was very afraid of, that it would be an all-consuming thing. And I've actually learned that it's much healthier if your marriage and your role in one area or another isn't all consuming and your entire defining identity. So that's good news because I have lots of parts of my identity that I want to preserve and share and still have when my kids are grown and off doing their own thing, right? Because
Mhm.
eventually I'm around, I mean, I'm with them for their lifetime, but they're only going to need me in the mother capacity that I imagine for a limited time, and I still got to figure out what else I'm going to do with my life too. So it's
It
a
probably
season.
goes back to what you were saying earlier about not putting too much emphasis on one or two friends, not leaning too much on one or two people to be your whole world, because it's too much for them to shoulder and it's not enough for you.
Mm-hmm.
And so if your children become your whole world and you have nothing outside your children, it's really putting too much of a burden on your children, because now they have to bear the weight of your entire, all of your hopes and dreams and expectations, and
Yes.
it's too much.
Talk about making anxiety and depression worse.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. No, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Diversification,
So
not just for stocks.
I have a thought that, not that you asked me, but I have a thought.
Yeah.
You have happier on a horse. Maybe after the baby's born, you can have happier as a mom or happier with a baby, and
Maybe.
and just chronicle the adventure, because I'm sure there's a lot of young women who are heading into the adventure of motherhood that would love somebody who's gone before and who can talk to them about what the experience is like.
That would be fun. Yeah, hopefully the audience is up for that. Making a little pivot.
Well,
Cuz
I'm going to
yeah.
take a vote. Anybody here that wants to see a video like that, put it in the comments.
Okay, yes. Thank you. Let me know. Yeah. I think adventure is a great way to look at some of this. And yeah. It, I realize, again with the anxiety and depression, I spend a heck of a lot of time thinking about what could go wrong, and I don't spend nearly enough time imagining what could go right. And I think as an artist, like living in fantasy has its value. And when it comes to our roles as, you know, wife, mother, whatever, like I want to spend more intentional time imagining how things could look cool, how things could be fun, how things could be adventurous, how things could be, put in your happy adjective there. Because it is easy to just go, oh my gosh, what if it goes like this? And like you were talking about, that downward spiral that gets narrower and narrower, and then you end up in a mental cage that, what is it, Mark Twain said, like, I have suffered greatly in my life and most of it never happened. Some quote like that.
Yeah.
Basically this idea that we create our own prison or our own hell in our mind before it's even walked its course. So
Yeah. I mean, I sure remember. I remember after my first husband left me and I was all alone in Japan and I had no source of income, and I didn't know what the future held, and I was just, all these catastrophes are going off in my brain day after day after day, and I'm just in anguish constantly.
oh,
And then at some point I just heard the Lord whisper to me, you know, the enemy doesn't know the future.
mm,
So whatever those pictures are that you're looking at, they got nothing to do with reality.
wow.
And that was like, oh wow, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, isn't it amazing how we can create such powerful imagery in our mind? And it's again, it's superpowers, it's a gift, but it can go so wrong if we're not bringing God into that picture. I always think of Harry Potter reference just because movies are so like top of mind for me. There's a scene. Have you watched the Harry Potter movies?
I've seen a few of them.
Yeah, there's one
I
scene
have a
toward
whole
the end.
episode on my show of speaking with an Anglican priest about Harry Potter and all the visuals that are in there that relate to
Ah,
Christianity. Really
yes.
interesting. Yeah.
So many. Oh, I need to watch that. There's a scene where Ron has to destroy one of the Horcruxes, and before he does it, this image of his worst fear, which is basically Hermione and Harry making out. Like, really, they've been in love this whole time, and he's the third wheel. And that it is so like sight, sound, taste, smell real for him. It just surrounds him 360. And he has to figure out how, in the midst of that, to take the sword and rush through the apparition and smash the necklace, basically, to make it go away. And, it's a very apropos, I feel like, pop culture reference to a lot of what we are called to do in terms of our thought life and in coping with anxiety and depression. Not that there aren't, obviously chemical connections involved too, but I always try to remember, like, is this an apparition that I need to take my sword and run through and crush in some capacity? Oh, I did want to mention, I'm totally random. Have you heard of Johann Hari? He's a journalist. He just came out with a new book talking about focus and attention, but he also talks about depression and anxiety. And he, British guy, really interesting, might be interesting to your audience. They probably maybe already are familiar with his work. But he does talk about the non-chemical, non-biological causes that contribute to anxiety and depression. And I felt like it speaks to what I was talking earlier about how much work sometimes it feels like to maintain your mental health. But he really backs it up with some interesting stories, and now his new book is on our lack of focus and social media and how that's impacting our ability to think.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really enjoying it. So that's another thing in the midst of this conversation. Brennan Manning, Johann Hari, a couple of people I've been reading recently that have been helpful. So
It sounds so great. I will put all this stuff in the show notes in the description so that people will have access to it.
yeah.
And I never knew you were a Firefly fan.
You didn't?
I've watched the whole series. Well, the whole series. The one season. I've watched it probably 4 times.
Yes.
Yeah. So good.
It is so good. I'm so mad that they got canceled. But yeah, there's a lot to unpack with that show.
Yeah.
So
super, super cool.
We
this has been so enriching, Stephanie, to talk to you and to see where you're at and to think about the coming of Vesper. This is going to be super exciting.
I am very excited. Yeah, any day now. So we'll see. We're doing a home birth. So
oh, really? So you've got a doula and all that?
Doula and a midwife. Ladies, that's another lie that childbirth has to be traumatizing. You start digging into the natural physiological birth movement, you'll find lots of other stories, just as a side. Because that was another thing that scared me off of kids. Is just like, it has to be this horrifying experience. Not to minimize anyone who's had a traumatic experience, because I know sometimes that does happen. But I think, again, back to the lies that we're fed, it has to always be. So yes, so part of the home birth thing is wanting to try something different, and we'll see how it goes. So yeah.
So you when you start feeling like it's time, you just call the doula and the midwife and they show up? Is that how it works?
Yeah, basically, they're like, when it gets to a point where you're not doing the cute, like, oh, I'm in labor. Oh, that was a contraction. That was lovely. And then back to doing your thing. But like when stuff gets serious and you're like, don't talk to me. that's the part where maybe they're like, you should call us. And there's some pain management techniques. Um, some women, apparently, I didn't even know this was a thing. Some women don't experience pain at all during childbirth. Some people have orgasmic births, which is really interesting. I'm all, heck yes, I'm praying for that. Um, but yeah, the doula will come first, and she'll tell Ryan like, hey, here's some things you can do. Have her move around. Let's get in the shower. Let's try this. Let's do that. Or to just normalize. Yeah, this is normal. Help me practice good breathing. Um, I'm big on protecting my pelvic floor as an equestrian. I'm learning a lot about those muscles. That's been really interesting. And then the midwife kind of just comes later in the game when it's really go time because she is the medical professional. We do not want her exhausted if the labor is long. So the
Mhm.
doula kind of comes early on as the support person, as the coach. And then the midwife comes for obviously the delivery, hopefully, unless you have what's called a precipitous birth where things are super fast. Sometimes they don't make it. And then she stays afterward, um, just to make sure everything's okay for a few hours. And then I get to stay at home. I get to like crawl in bed and cuddle the baby, which is great. And they come back and check on me every day for the next like 5 days. The two of them, they
Mhm.
alternate, make sure everything's okay. And that's the plan. So yeah.
Well, I can hardly wait to hear. So
Yes, I will be sharing when we're back on our feet. We get to meet her.
very cool.
But
Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to
yeah,
talk with me
no,
about these things. And
thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to share some things that hopefully is helpful to somebody. Um, I'm always happy to answer questions or chat if anyone wants to follow up or anything. But yeah, I appreciate having the opportunity. I love the work that you're doing on your channel. So it
oh,
just feels
thank
like an
you.
honor to be able to support the conversation.
Thank you. Give my best to Ryan and the girls.
I will. Thanks, Karen. Love you.
I love you too. Bye bye.
Bye.